Hey, Ian here again, and this week I'm going to talk about the great video game crash of 1983. I'll start with the arcades. Now, in the early 1980s, arcades were enjoying something of a golden age. In 1981 alone, Americans dropped over 20 billion quarters into arcade machines. However, by mid-1982, the market had become way oversaturated and arcade revenue started going down significantly. It was also around this time that home video game consoles were evolving to the point where they could provide a comparable video game experience to what you'd get in the arcades, and that was pretty much the final nail in the coffin for the arcade golden age. Alright, next I'm going to talk about Nolan Bushnell. He is, of course, the founder of Atari, as well as Chuck E. Cheese. He created Pong. In 1976, he sold Atari to Warner, shortly after which he created the Atari 2600. Then, in November 1978, Bushnell left Atari over disagreements between himself and his corporate overlords at Warner. And as a result of his departure, Atari became much more corporatized. Atari between 1979 and 1983 was much more concerned about profits than innovation. Perhaps the biggest example of this was the E.T. video game. It was hastily developed over a 6-week period so that it would be out in time to capitalize on the film's release as well as the holiday season. Of course, the game was horrible and a commercial failure, and it contributed heavily to the crash of '83. Alright, finally, I'm going to touch on Activision. In 1979, 4 key developers at Atari were dissatisfied with the way Atari was treating them, and they left to start their own video game company. Activision was essentially the first third-party developer, and they were rather successful at that. Activision was basically the George Washington of third-party video game developers. Now, from my view, they didn't contribute directly to the great video game crash of 1983. They were one of the most consistently good developers of that era, arguably even better than Atari at the time. However, their success as the first third-party developer paved the way for countless small, talentless development teams to churn out shitty game after shitty game for the Atari. Eventually, the market was completely flooded with crap. Thus, consumer confidence went way down around this time. Hence, the great video game crash of 1983. Just a couple of short years later, Nintendo would resolve this issue by introducing the Nintendo Seal of Quality. Basically, third-party developers would need to get Nintendo's stamp of approval to make games for the NES. And now, all is well. Alright, that about does it for this week's video. I will catch you all next week.